Right. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us at what is an unusual hour for those of us on the West Coast. Appreciate you coming out for this. This is a panel jointly co-hosted by Socialists of Caltech and Caltech APITA Plus, which stands for Asian Pacific Islander Desi American, on the topic of Sinophobia, McCarthyism, and the new Cold War in academia. This is a topic that I think is near and dear to the experiences of many in the Caltech community and their families. And the broader context is that as the United States is escalating its hybrid military, economic, and propaganda campaign against China to levels not seen since the Cold War, we've observed many Chinese and Chinese-descended researchers in the US really finding themselves the targets of racialized suspicion amid a broader rise in anti-Asian hate, particularly in the past year during the COVID-19 pandemic. And so to explore the history and the political context for this latter-day McCarthyism in the context of the new Cold War and its impact on the lives and careers of those in its crosshairs, we are joined today by two fantastic panelists. We have Carl Jia, who was actually a Caltech alum, graduating class of 2000, Page House. He's currently based in Bali, and he is the host of the Silk and Steel podcast, which focuses on the history, culture, and politics of China and the surrounding regions. I've personally found it tremendously informative and educational. And we're also joined by Kevin Lee. He's a STEM student based in California and a member of Qiao Collective, where he translates works from Chinese to English. Without further ado, I think we have some prepared remarks by both of our speakers of around 10 to 15 minutes each. And after that, we can sort of get into a Q&A. And we would definitely welcome audience participation in that as well. So, if at any point a question pops up, feel free to drop it in the chat or to use the Q&A feature just sort of add it to the queue once we get to that. But for now, Carl, why don't you take it away? Carl?
Oh, me?
Yeah,
sorry. I was waiting for Kevin. Hi guys.
No worries.
I'm Carl Jia, and thank you for thanks to Charles for that wonderful introduction. I am speaking from Bali, like Charles mentioned. I'm also a Caltech alum. I think what I want to point out, the new McCarthyism is actually not new. I'm old enough to remember when I first arrived in the United States in 1990. My parents are the first generation Chinese students who came to study in the United States after the open and reform in the open and reform era in China. So post-Cultural Revolution, my dad was among one of the first Chinese students who came to study in the US. And I remember Connie Chang, who was a very visible, I think the only Chinese American broadcaster in American mainstream media back then. She went on record on national television and said, all Chinese students are basically potential spies. and that really hit home because, my dad was a postgrad slaving away in University of Illinois in Chicago. And through him, I realized how much US research institution is dependent on the labors of underpaid and unpaid Chinese postgrad students. And since then, it's really gotten worse, right? In 1999, we have the Wen-Ho Lee case. again, the US government, Department of Justice, accusing him of stealing nuclear secrets for China. And we have at the time, the Secretary of Energy, Bill Richardson, announced in national television, naming Wen-Ho Lee as a suspect, right? And Wen-Ho Lee was actually a Taiwanese American. He is from Taiwan, but it didn't matter because his ethnicity made him suspect. And in the end, there was the U.S. government had only one charge against him, which was not dropped, which was that he mishandled sensitive information. But for this, Wen-Ho Lee was actually held in solitary confinement in pretrial, and his life and career was ruined. Eventually, Bill Clinton apologized to him. I think the U.S. government paid $1.6 million in settlement to Wen-Ho Lee, but the damage was already done, right? And I remember during the Wen-Ho Lee case, I was actually still in Caltech, and I remember that at that time it seems there was already a hysteria about all these Chinese American or Chinese nationals in U.S. research institutions stealing secrets for China. And at that time, I did not foresee, I thought that was as bad as it gets. And until Trump. And now we have Department of Justice. I think, I'm trying to remember the figure from the top of my head. I think the Department of Justice opened 60,000 cases against Chinese Americans all over the country, and so far, the ones that have been charged are charged on nothing related to espionage cases, but on things like visa fraud or not representing or not reporting the funds received from China, right? Which very minor infractions, and but in the news it's represented as, oh, we have this serious endemic Chinese spying efforts against the United States. But of all the cases they have so far charged the Chinese scientists with is like visa fraud. One person was a cancer researcher, and they alleged she was not truthful on her visa application because she did not disclose her past work with the PLA. Apparently she worked in some PLA, People's Liberation Army hospital. And that was the charge that brought against her. I mean, and the people who've been charged with are in the fields like medicine, microbiology, and cancer research, right? I mean, nothing that's even considered sensitive. So I think for anybody who is of the Chinese heritage, who work in the STEM field, I think they're feeling the fire right now. I was in a chat group with a bunch of my friends who are still in US. I'm in Bali now, and yeah, they have been now talking about Plan B. What would they do if the U.S. This kind of red bait keep going? I mean, they're seriously thinking about relocation, with their family outside of U.S. That's how far it has gone. I have never envisioned we will come to this. Just even like 5-6 years ago, if you tell me that, I would say you're crazy. I have a surf buddy who is half Korean. He's half Korean, half Greek, and he was a professor of applied mathematics from UCLA, and he was looking for a private industry job. And at the time, as you know, most of the job are U.S. defense industry related. So he had to apply for clearance, and he used to joke to me, say, "Oh, is it by knowing you, by being friends with you, a person with mainland Chinese background, is that going to get me in trouble? Am I going to get denied clearance for this? We used to laugh about this. It was a joke. But now it's not a joke anymore. This is serious. So yeah, I'm glad Charles, you're hosting this forum to talk about this issue, because I think it's pretty serious, especially for people of Chinese descent and Chinese background.
Great, thanks so much for sharing, Carl. Yeah, and I guess next up, let's hear from Kevin. And again, I just want to remind everyone, including those who recently joined, if you have any questions for either of our speakers, please feel free to drop them in the chat or through the Q&A function, or if you'd like to ask it in person afterwards, you can, I guess, use the raise hand feature. But yeah, for now, Kevin, why don't you take it away?
Yeah, I appreciate the invite. I have a set of very, very simple slides. What I think is going on, this is like how I interpret this, and I'm speaking as a member of Qiao Collective. I'm speaking as a STEM student. I'm speaking as someone who is like very closely associated with a lot of like not just students but also academics of Chinese descent in the United States. What I see is like a confluence of a lot of like historical events kind of coming into play right now. So, and I think the best way to, a good way of understanding what's happening right now is to take a look back into modern Chinese history. So the image I have here is a depiction of the First Opium War. Back in the 1800s, during the period of European and Japanese colonial expansion into places like Africa, the Middle East, and Asia, China was definitely not an exception. So one of the main, or like at least a huge source of profits for Americans and British was actually the opium trade. So at the time, China had one of probably what I would wager is the most severe opioid epidemic in all of history. You had some people say, maybe like a fifth of people in Shanghai were addicted to opium. So as the Qing dynasty wanted to put that to a stop, Western powers declared war and then kind of forced China open through a series of unequal treaties. And these treaties are kind of like, as a consequence of these treaties, we had a kind of forced contact between imperialist powers, including businesses, including missionaries, and Chinese people who were facing this like double challenge of feudalism within the country as well as imperialism and foreign invasion. So, and this period between the 1840s and the end of the Chinese Civil War is what is known today as the Century of Humiliation, referring to this very dark period in Chinese history. So as I said earlier, I alluded to this earlier, but one of the consequences of the Opium Wars was basically unlimited access into China by Chinese missionaries. So what missionaries bring with them, there's this bit of an exchange going on. So what they can bring with them is this like very valuable like goods and services that they obtained through extraction of the global South, right? They have access to medicine, they have access to Western science, they can provide education. So that's what they're doing in exchange for Western influence, the spread of Christianity, and essentially like the replacement of traditional Chinese, I guess, epistemologies. So on the left here, we have these white European missionaries dressed up in Chinese garb. And then on the right, we have a man named Young Wing. He's actually the first graduate of an American university of Chinese descent. And so he himself, like, this was like the first, I guess what you would consider like the first like Chinese student, one of the first Chinese students in the United States. So he himself was a recipient of missionary education in China before moving to United States. And he actually had, when he went back to China after his graduation, he was actually quite patriotic despite a very Western education. He was very patriotic. What he proposed to the Qing Dynasty government was what he called the educational mission, or the Chinese educational mission, and his goal was to assist the reform and the modernization of China, which at that time was, this imperial, or this very feudal, what we would consider like underdeveloped society. So what he wanted to do was send students into the US, have them study concepts such as engineering and management and science, and then come back to China and help reform and properly develop the country. So on the left-hand side here, we have these very, very young children. Actually, they were probably they're between middle school age and I would say college aged. You have these kids here playing baseball. The mission was eventually canceled because a lot of the people who went became too westernized. There were worries of losing loyalty to the Qing dynasty. But what did end up happening was a lot of these people, a lot of these alums of this program did in fact make very significant contributions to Chinese society at the time. In the middle, we have Liang Cheng, who is a very important diplomat who I will talk a little bit more about later. And then on the very right, we have Zhan Tianyou, a bust of Zhan Tianyou, who developed the first railroad in China. So you can see, this is what I would consider like the first wave of Chinese international students studying in the US, acquiring skills, acquiring knowledge, and then going back, and then you have a not insignificant portion of them actually like making very significant contributions to the country. And then another very important event related to this, Chinese students is actually the Boxer Rebellion, which was in the early 1900s, a kind of mass anti-imperialist revolt occurring throughout the country, targeting people like missionaries, soldiers stationed in foreign occupied Chinese cities. However, most of the rebellion was comprised of peasants who didn't really stand much of a chance to the most resource-rich imperialist powers at the time. And China was again forced to sign another unequal treaty, which is a photo of which is on the right-hand side here. However, one of the side effects of this treaty, of the series of treaties, is the creation of what's called the Boxer Indemnity Scholarship. This is actually negotiated by Liang Cheng, the diplomat who I alluded to earlier. So he negotiated with the US government. So China paid an extremely large sum to Western powers as a result. The US apportioned a small fraction of these funds to fund scholarships for Chinese students in the US, and also the creation of Chinese universities. So we have, this is on the right-hand side here, we have Tsinghua University, which is now known as like one of the most prestigious universities in China, particularly well known for its STEM education. On the left, we have one of the recipients of the Boxer Indemnity Scholarship, Qian Xuesen. He is also a Caltech, or at the time, I don't remember if he is a Caltech alum, but he's at least a former faculty of Caltech, and recipient of the scholarship. And after the completion of the Chinese Civil War in 1949, he felt like it was appropriate for him to kind of go back and help rebuild China after a century of internal conflict and a century of war. So this is actually when we see kind of some traces of, or I guess like one of the first instances of McCarthyism as it applies to Chinese people or Chinese people in the United States. So he loses his security clearance in Caltech, decides he wants to move to China. However, he is detained for a very extended period of time because the United States does not want secrets or so-called secrets to be sent to China. So he is detained. Eventually, he is able to go back to China, where he actually makes extremely significant contributions, including the development of China's nuclear weapons program and then China's missile program. So him, and then not just him, but also several people, not only in academia, but in more working class environments as well. They were targeted by the FBI for suspected espionage and communist activity. So just like a personal tidbit, like I have a very distant relative who came to study in the US during the 1930s and stayed here. He was working in the New York City Chinatown for a Chinese left-wing newspaper. But many of his colleagues were actually detained and interrogated by the FBI. And as a result of this persecution, he actually had to go back to China as well, where he became a professor of English language until his retirement. So we're during the 1950s, we're facing this time of very explicit McCarthyism, very explicit persecution. But at the same time, we see this recurring theme of very talented people from China who are educated in the US or educated elsewhere in the West. And once again, they are, when they go back to China, they actually do, in fact, bring a lot of value. They bring a lot of value in the form of knowledge, in the form of skills, in the form of, access to knowledge. And so, the Boxer Indemnity Scholarship provided essentially a small wave of Chinese international students in the US, which subsided shortly after which kind of came to a pause after the Chinese Civil War, where the United States and the People's Republic did not establish formal diplomatic relations. The international students that were coming, the Chinese students that were coming into the US were actually mostly from the Republic of China or Taiwan, or they're coming from Hong Kong, which was at the time a British territory. So, but students from the mainland were an extremely small if they existed at all. So this was until the reform and opening up period in 1978. So 1978. So this is what Carl was alluding to when talking about his own family. So this is when Chinese students were, able to study again in the United States. So while Chinese students again had access to the United States, and a very important issue was the problem of brain drain, where a lot of Chinese students, they studied in the United States, funded by government scholarships. However, a lot of them ended up staying for multitude of reasons, right? A lot of them stay in the U.S. Maybe the salaries are much higher, the quality of life at the time, the disparity in the quality of life at the time was quite large. So we have this issue of brain drain, where we only of the students that go abroad, only about 1/3 or 1/4 actually come back to China. And then I added this image of the Tiananmen Square protest because I think that was a very very obvious case where the Tiananmen Square protests were a large faction of the protesters were students, and then a lot actually studied in the U.S. later, and there's actually something known as the June 4th green card. So after June 4th, the United States government actually issued green cards to over 30,000 Chinese students in the United States at the time. So again, that is a very, very explicit attempt at getting this talent away from China. So and that's kind of this reform and reopening up period was the start of this next wave of Chinese scholars in the United States. Many of them were sympathetic to the United States. Brain drain issues were quite large. But then moving on to the next generation, we have something happening that's very interesting. So on the left here, we have a graph of the number of students in the US from China. You can just pay attention to this blue line here. So we see this like huge uptick at around 2008. And that's because in the wake of the financial crisis, we had a lot of economic loss, both like we lose both state funding for a lot of public universities. And then we also have a lot of like private university endowments plummeting in value just because of the economic downfall. So in order to supplement their funding, they actually attracted a lot of international students, particularly those from China, which like whose society was becoming increasingly wealthy. So we have we have this happening again. Students in China from the US are kind of really the growth was really booming until very recently, until like 2018, 2019, when the conflict between the US and Chinese governments became increasingly aggressive on the part of the United States. So, and I think a very important concept is like, so on the bottom left here, we see that we see this brain drain issue going away slowly. So of the Chinese students going abroad, as we kind of move along in time, the proportion of students returning back to China is actually increasing by quite a bit. And this is because, as China's economy is developing, what was the base of like China's economy, manufacturing, we see this transition into more like high value like sectors such as R&D, branding, and like marketing. So this is where the talent is going, right? When they return home, most of them go to private enterprises, but we see that there's development of like these like high value sectors. And on the top right here, like this is not just students. I want to emphasize that this is not just students, but senior level academics as well. So on the top right, we have, I included pictures of two people. On the left is a man called Professor Shi Yigong, and on the right is Professor Rao Yi. And these are two very high profile naturalized US citizens from China who were like very much leading professors in their field. I believe Shi Yigong was a biophysicist and Rao Yi a neuroscientist. But in the early 2010s, both of them they received a lot of attention because they actually renounced their US citizenships and moved back to China. Shi Yigong actually recently founded a new university explicitly for STEM-focused research, and Rao Yi became like a dean. He's been dean of several universities in China, and we see at not just on an individual basis, so we see the government doing a lot to recruit people. So on the bottom right here, I added a logo of the 1,000 Talents program, which is a series of incentives for people of Chinese descent who work abroad, either as academics, managers, engineers, etc., to actually come back to China and live in China for a very significant period of time throughout the year, developing private business, developing like the knowledge base, and providing resources necessary for like high value development in China. So we see this reverse brain drain going on as well. And so this growth of this economic growth, what the US considered this like a very much a threat to United States hegemony. So we're seeing this escalation in aggression from the US onto China. You have like accusations of intellectual property theft, which is actually like consensual technology transfers that foreign firms undergo in order to do business in China. You have the trade war, which very much threatens like the exports in China. So you have this aggression on the behalf of the United States. So again, we're seeing this pattern of Chinese academic or Chinese people studying in the United States, And we're seeing increased numbers actually go back and develop the country. So this is not too different from before. But what we now see is like a threat to U.S. hegemony, as as the Chinese government becomes more wealthy and more powerful on the international stage. What we see right now is very much a response to that threat. And so there have been quite a few like high profile cases. I believe Carl actually mentioned a few, but we have cancer epidemiologists, we have biochemists, neuroscientists. So we see like a lot of very much like race-based or ethnicity-based targeting of like senior level academics in the United States. Again, as Carl mentioned, like most of these issues you will actually like I would bet that you would find them in quite a few US labs. Like for instance, you fail or you forget to report relationships with Chinese universities or consultancies with Chinese companies. You're assigned a review article, and then you ask one of your students, or you ask somebody else to look at it on your behalf, et cetera, et cetera. So in terms of actual evidence, as Carl says, the actual amount of evidence against these researchers is very very minimal, I would say. And then on the bottom right here, I added there was an article published in like a letter published in Science from several Chinese academics titled "Racial Profiling Harms Science." So where they are trying to push against this trend of persecution of academics. So that's all I have. But kind of in generally speaking, right? Like the United States as an imperial power derives much of its wealth from a lot of extraction of resources in the global South. But what we're seeing is kind of with China in particular, is kind of a reverse of that trend, as what would normally be brain drain talent going back to China. You would normally have students who would want to, like previously would want to stay in the United States, going back to China in larger numbers, developing this like kind of high value economic base. And what we're seeing is a push against that. It's extremely xenophobic. It's very much McCarthyist, as this is kind of this Red Scare boogeyman. And yeah, that's all I have to share. And thank you for listening.
I'd like to add a couple of things to Kevin's excellent presentation.
Yes, please.
On the boxer indemnity, it's actually the Liang Chen, who I believe Kevin mentioned. He's a Chinese diplomat. What he noticed was that China actually overpaid the amount that US asked for, originally demanded for its portion of boxer indemnity. So China overpaid US, and there was a discussion about what US is going to do with that excessive payment. Is it going to return to China? And then at the time in early 20th century, around 1904, 1903, the news of mistreatment of Chinese and Chinese American in US traveled back to China. That actually led to a national boycott of American goods. And at the time, the US government again faced the decision how to end the American boycott in China. In the end, they decided they're not going to send in force, mostly in consideration of other foreign powers who have their own designs on China. And the Liang Chen's proposal actually come in at a perfect timing, because he suggested to win goodwill from the Chinese public, use this as a PR opportunity to return the excessive payment from China, and then to fund a university which would then educate the next generation of Chinese intellectuals who might be pro-American. So that's where the Tsinghua University came about. And Another thing about Chen Xuesen, he got his master degree at MIT. When he came to study US, he went to MIT. But after he got his master degree, he went with his advisor von Karman to Caltech, and that's where he got his PhD, and he stayed on as a Caltech faculty, and he co-founded the JPL. So he was actually play a quite significant role in the early years of Caltech. And the reason the FBI nabbed him, because in the 1930s he went to a party, like a communist, a party gathering of the Communist Party members in Pasadena, of his friends in Caltech. And because his name was on that list of the people who attended the party, unbeknownst to Chen Xuesen at the time, one of the there are a couple founders of the JPL, but one of them was an FBI informant, and he supplies a list to the FBI. So Chen Xuesen, that was the reason Chen Xuesen lost his security clearance, and they investigated him for being a Chinese communist spy, because this is in 1949 when Chinese communist finally took over mainland China. Now there was a raging debate in US about who lost China, right? Like China is US's possession in the first place. And then, basically that's where that's what drove the first wave of McCarthyism, is who lost China? Oh, it must be all these communist spies in our midst, people like Chen Xuesen, and which actually drove him away. He eventually went back to China to become the father of Chinese space program and the missile program. And by the way, they just China just launched a Mars probe, and this is and again, like China, China wanted to have cooperation with United States. That has been the Chinese policy ever since the post Cultural Revolution era, since Reform and Opening era. And just some anecdotal stories about my family. My dad, among my dad's generation of Chinese students who came to study in the United States, very few went back to China after they got their degree. I would say, maybe less than 20% returned to China. At the time, Deng Xiaoping, the leader of China, actually said that's okay, because even if 20% of them comes back, that's still a boom to China's science and research. But what happened gradually is that I started noticing this by 2000. Some of my dad's classmates went back to China as first as a senior VPs of their respective company, being to work as a representatives of U.S. multinationals in China. But then there's some of them went back to China to found their own company, because they realized it's the glass ceiling in U.S. corporate world meant a person with mainland Chinese background can only go so far, and they have a lot more growth. For the more ambitious, career-oriented Chinese students, they went back because they realized back in China, the sky is limit with the growth of Chinese economy. So I started noticing that by I say starting from early 2000s, I have hear more and more stories of my dad's classmates who in United States now going back to China, founding their own companies to become captain of their own industry. And again, there's also Chinese government and Chinese universities also actively sought cooperations with universities and other other research institutions in the West. In 2019, I visited my dad's hometown in Haining, Zhejiang. And in Haining, they opened a campus for Zhejiang University International Campus. It's where it was done in cooperation with several international schools, including UIUC, University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, where they invite American, British, European professors to come to the campus and teach the course as they would in their own respective campuses. So these are the different channels China is trying to cooperate with US. In addition to what Kevin mentioned about the China's 1,000 talent program to attract back the overseas Chinese talent, China is also actively funding research programs abroad in US universities. That's why we have but that's what's being under attack right now, these Sino-American cooperation in fields of science. First of all, the US have banned China from joining the International Space Station. That's a reason why China right now, they're launching their own space station right now, because they're banned to join ISS. And the ISS is actually getting old. In a few years after ISS retire, there's just going to be a Chinese space station out there. I mean, this is the result of American policy, and there's also the rationale behind the U.S. national security establishment is actually they're driving for active decoupling of U.S. and China economy. And because in their mind, it's a lot easier to have a confrontation with China without all the entangling interests. And that's what we have seen what happened under Trump administration. Because if people who are paying attention, Trump relied on a lot of the military men in his administration, right? So the Pentagon basically wrote the foreign policy. But one thing to note is that it's not just Trump, because Biden has basically continued the Trump policy. Like what we talk about, the persecution of Chinese researchers, that have continued under Biden administration. And the Department of Justice under Biden have continually bring cases and charges against Chinese Americans and Chinese nationals working in US under all these bogus charges. So we are not seeing any improvement after Trump was voted out of office. And that's why it's more important we have this discussion right now, because we're really at a very dangerous moment when people think, like there are people in Washington actually think reviving Cold War 2.0, starting Cold War 2.0 is actually a good idea, right? And to decouple with China, both in terms of both economically and also in any fields of cooperation, including science and research, they felt that was a prerequisite for the Cold War 2.0. And right now everything is going according to their plan, and which bode ill for especially for people of Chinese descent in US right now.
I'd like to kind of back on that. Thank you. Yeah, thanks for adding on, Carl. There's a question in the chat asking, if like the economic downfall from the pandemic would cause universities to try harder to attract Chinese international students, and kind of being this economic conflict that would force the US to stop the intellectual persecution of Chinese academics. So I think this is like a very interesting conflict of interests between individual universities and scientific establishments, and what's essentially the US national security complex. Because every time, we've seen in last year and the years before, we had the Trump administration, released these really absurd restrictions on visas, right? Like international student visas. We see this like some sort of like very absurd limitations, very absurd like restrictions. Always at the forefront though, however, is like universities and their legal teams, like planting lawsuits against the administration. So, and I'd like to add on to Carl's point is that like both U.S. universities and Chinese educational institutes are very much like pushing for increased study abroad into the U.S. Right? We actually have like administration representatives from U.S. universities fly all the way to China and do this like tour circuit of these high schools in China. And like high schools in response, high schools will have curriculums designed to send students abroad, like curriculums in English where they take like AP and IB curricula. So again, like in terms of like economic conflict and persecution of academics, this is actually like this is a bit of like an internal contradiction, I would say. Yeah,
I agree with that, and I think there's all these talk about so-called U.S. national interest, right? What is a U.S. national interest? A lot of times when they talk about U.S. national interest, they're really talking about the interest of the U.S. The military-industrial complex, right? I mean, it's obvious to anyone who's involved in the U.S. university space. The Chinese overseas students that they provide a huge bulk of the funding to the U.S. Institution of higher learning right now. I mean, it doesn't make sense from the university perspective to cut off cooperation from China to restrict Chinese students. But all these tensions do wonderful for all the weapon manufacturers and all the defense contractors, for all the think tanks who receive their funding from all these weapon manufacturers. So we continue, and these people are driving the narrative right now. These are the people who write op-eds in the newspapers, in New York Times. These people who are driving all these China scare narrative, and I know there are opposing voices like that article in Science or of academics raising the issue about how racial profiling hurts U.S. But these voices have been drowned out. They're being drowned out by the war hawks, right? The people who benefit from U.S.-China confrontation. I mean, like, it's like war on Afghanistan. How does war on Afghanistan for the last 20 years benefited U.S. national interest, right? It's the so-called national interest. What it did is it provided a continuous funding stream for all these various defense contractors, all the private military contractors, all these special interest groups, right? And unfortunately, those people who have hijacked our policy, U.S. policy, they just don't care too much for, they never really cared so much for the U.S. universities in any case, right? I mean, that's how U.S. universities have come to depend on overseas Chinese students to paying the bills in the first place, and that's where we are.
Great, thank you so much to both of you for sharing. Yeah, especially getting so into depth about the broader political economy considerations here, how it plays into the history of U.S.-China relations for the past century or more, and also China's developmental strategy during that time. I guess one note that I would want to make specifically in regard to Qiao is there was actually a previous event earlier this month hosted by, again, Caltech APITA Plus for, API Heritage Month. I believe it was actually hosted by JPL, but it was advertised through APITA Plus. And I think there's a recording to that somewhere. I'm not entirely sure, but if anyone from APITA Plus knows, please feel free to drop that in the chat, because that was a very informative event as well, about a very fascinating historical character. Yeah, so there was one more audience question in the chat, which I guess I'll sort of pose to both of you, if you'd like to answer, and that would sort of bring us up on the hour. So yeah, I guess the one other question that's been asked from Ashay is essentially, how this compares in the international context. In particular, have Chinese descended academics faced similar challenges in Europe or India, or is the US a particular epicenter for this persecution? And then we have a comment from Prakash on that, where he says that he thinks the same sentiment is rife in Canada and the UK. So, if either of you can speak on that. Of course, you both were / are US based, but if you happen to know,
I think it's the same in all the Five Eyes countries. So, Prakash already mentioned the other two Anglo country, Canada and UK, right? The Five Eyes countries are the five Anglo countries that decide to do intelligence sharing. So that's US, Canada, UK, Australia, and New Zealand. And right now, the level of xenophobia in Australia, that's actually even worse than United States, I would say. Australia while the US was under that whole Russiagate controversy a few years ago, Australia were doing how China is hijacking our political landscape, founding our political parties, taking over Australia, right? So yeah, it's pretty bad. It's pretty bad in all the Anglo countries. I can't speak for Europe, just because that's I don't know. I'm more familiar with United States. As for India, I don't know if there's a lot of Chinese academics in India. To be honest, I think like the China-India cooperation, there was a lot of cooperation in like high-tech startups scene. There's a lot of Chinese capital that went into India IT startups. But that has been put a kibosh on because of the recent China-India border conflict, and also because India signed up with the Quad, right? The so-called Quad of democracies, US, India, Australia, and Japan, to contain China. So since then, just a couple of years ago, India has banned all these both Chinese apps but also Chinese investment into the Indian IT startup space. So that funding is drying up. So yeah, so that's what I know.
Thanks, Kevin. Did you have anything to add to that? Or?
This is a little bit outside of my sphere of knowledge, but I will say like the 1,000 Talents program, the 1,000 Talents plan. It's not targeted just towards people based in the United States. Like anyone from outside of China is eligible to apply. The concerns of that, kind of outside of US borders, I'm not sure, but that could be an angle to do some digging into. Yeah, but yeah, I think Carl got most of it though.
Great, thanks so much. Yeah, so that was a really engaging discussion, and we did manage to get to, I think, all the audience questions that came up in the chat, and we're pretty much right at the hour. So yeah, I guess I just wanted to ask, Kevin and Carl, if you had any sort of like last thoughts that you want to share, or anything that you want to promote, in terms of the respective projects that you're involved in, namely Silk and Steel and Qiao. Then yeah, maybe we could use the last couple of minutes to wrap up with that. But again, thank you both so much for your time and for sharing your insights.
Definitely check out Silk and Steel podcast. It's available on most of the podcasting platform, iTunes, Spotify, Podbean, Stitcher, and definitely Patreon. Go check out my Patreon, Silk and Steel podcast on Patreon. This is help me fund my lifestyle in Bali to stay away from US so I don't have to come back. And I try to have a wide ranging of guests to talk about China related issues. I recently had a tour manager, Australian expat tour manager of a tour company that runs guided tour to North Korea. It was a fascinating conversation. It's something, I learned a lot just talking with him. So check it out and subscribe and subscribe.
Thanks, Carl. Kevin?
Yeah, I'm speaking on behalf of Qiao Collective. So we produce mainly writings, and we also organize like webinar events similar to this. So you can find us at qiaocollective.com. And we're also on most social media platforms, so like Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. That's at Qiao Collective. Yeah.
Great. And for full disclosure, I am also a member of Qiao Collective. So yeah, with that, we're at 9 p.m. sharp Pacific time, noon in Bali. And again, thank you so much for joining us. And for sharing all your insights. I think this was tremendously informative for everyone watching. So really appreciate you joining us, and thank you to everyone who joined at this strange hour to talk about this issue. And with that, let us wrap up.